Okay, so let's dive into this. We had a listener request about influence and belief and, well, what people often call brainwashing. And it's funny, my own interest actually started kind of close to home with my neighbors.
Really? A personal connection? That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Yeah, it was. It was pretty strange. I moved up to the hills near San Diego, lovely area, avocados, eucalyptus. And I find out that just a few miles away in this big gated house, well, my neighbors had castrated themselves.
Wow. Okay, that's
Right.
quite a start.
Right. And apparently that wasn't even all of it. They lived super quietly, ran a web design business, said they were like students of spiritual enlightenment. Most people just thought, oh, some weird religious group.
Hmm.
But it really stuck with me. What could possibly make people do something so extreme?
That really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The power of belief, how influence can shape actions, even in ways that seem totally irrational from the outside.
Exactly. And looking into their beliefs, which were, let's say, unconventional, I realized this whole idea of coercive persuasion or brainwashing, whatever term you use, it pops up more than you'd think. It's like this recurring nightmare from the 20th century.
The 20th century certainly was fertile ground for that kind of thing. All the ideological clashes, new forms of mass communication.
Totally. And that's really the core of this deep dive. We're going to trace the history of coercive persuasion, mainly using Joel Dimsdale's book, Dark Persuasion, a history of brainwashing from Pavlov to social media.
Okay.
And it's fascinating because he covers so much ground, military stuff, Cold War conflicts, cults, criminal groups. He mentions talking to like everyone, spies, doctors, church leaders, even criminals.
It really pulls from everywhere, doesn't it? Psychology, history, sociology, even neuroscience comes into play later on.
Right. So our mission here is to try and understand, the psychology, the societal factors, how people can be convinced to believe things or do things that seem totally against their own interests. So where do we start with such a long history?
Well, it probably makes sense to look at the roots, the historical precedents.
Yeah.
I mean, long before anyone called it brainwashing, these kinds of coercive techniques were definitely being used.
Right, like the Inquisition, Dimsdale mentions them, and the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana.
Exactly. Their methods for getting confessions sound absolutely brutal. Holding people for ages, no sleep, barely any food, constant psychological games.
Just grinding them down.
Trying to make them feel guilty, make them crave punishment just to make it stop. It was about completely breaking their will.
It highlights that core tactic, doesn't it? Makes someone incredibly vulnerable, then they're easier to influence.
Precisely. Then you have something seemingly different, like early religious conversions.
Oh, yeah, John Wesley's open-air preaching. Dimsdale talks about the intense reactions people had, collapsing, crying, shouting.
And William Sargent later suggested a physiological link there. He looked at things like fasting, repetitive hymns, isolation, crisis narratives.
These you see in some religious practices.
Right. And Sargent argued these could actually impair normal brain function, make people more suggestible. He tied it back to Pavlov's work on conditioned reflexes.
So linking these really profound spiritual experiences to, like, messing with the nervous system, that feels a bit unsettling.
It's definitely a perspective, maybe a controversial one for some. But Dimsdale also brings in anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann's work. She studied modern evangelicals.
Okay.
And she observed similar elements: silence, fasting, isolation. Her point was that even if someone feels they're hearing God, that experience is still processed through their biology, shaped by their social world.
So even voluntary conversions might have these underlying mechanisms at play, making people more open.
It's a key idea, yeah. The interplay between belief, biology, and the social context. It's crucial.
Okay, so fast forward then. The Cold War hits, and this whole idea suddenly gets way more political, much darker.
Oh, absolutely. The Cold War was this massive ideological struggle. It wasn't just about territory. It was about minds, getting confessions, converting people. You saw those show trials starting up again with these completely bizarre confessions.
And then Korea. That's really when brainwashing explodes into public consciousness, isn't it? Because of the American POWs.
Exactly. The U.S. government was baffled and, frankly, terrified by some POWs confessing or seeming to switch sides. It kicked off this huge, almost frantic research effort.
Into what?
Everything. Sensory deprivation, psychedelic drugs like LSD, group dynamics, neuroscience. They were desperate to know. What were the communists doing? How could they protect their own troops? Could they force information out of people? Could they even, erase memories?
It really does sound like science fiction.
It pushed the boundaries, definitely, and fueled a lot of secret and often pretty ethically dubious research.
Let's go back to those Soviet show trials for a second. Dimsdale sets the scene: rough economy, shaky government. These trials were pure propaganda, right? Distraction.
Total propaganda. There was zero impartial justice. The whole thing was staged. And the confessions were so wild, people just assumed there had to be some secret Soviet technique involved. Pavlov's name kept coming up.
And the reactions at the time were all over the place. You had Walter Duranty from the New York Times just buying it, saying it was genuine guilt and Bolshevik fervor.
Incredible, isn't it? His reporting was completely discredited later, of course. But it shows how even smart observers can get sucked into the narrative, especially when information is controlled.
A real warning sign there.
Definitely. And the interrogation tactics themselves were nasty, accusing people of being enemies just because they knew someone. Psychological tricks to confuse them, break them down, just as constant erosion of their reality.
A systematic dismantling of the self.
That's a good way to put it. That's central to coercive persuasion.
And this fear, this drive to figure out Soviet methods, it also pushed the military towards truth drugs, though that started earlier, didn't it? World War II.
Correct. During WWII, they were looking at drugs for two main reasons. Getting intel, obviously, but also treating combat trauma, like shell shock or PTSD as we'd call it now.
How did that work?
They used intravenous barbiturates. Sodium amytal was a common one. It was called narcoanalysis or narcosuggestion. The idea was to lower inhibitions, help soldiers relive and process repressed traumatic memories.
Dimsdale gives that example, the soldier reliving the mortar attack. Sounds incredibly intense.
It shows the power of these drugs to access deep emotions. But, and this is crucial for interrogation, does being drugged guarantee you're telling the truth?
Probably not, right? You might just be more suggestible or confused.
Exactly. Intoxication isn't truth serum. Dimsdale mentions a patient revealing their real age under the drug, something they'd hidden, and being really distressed by it. It bypassed their control, but wasn't necessarily useful intelligence.
So it was unreliable.
Very. Which led researchers like Gottschalk to think people could actually be trained to resist interrogation under these drugs. His advice sounds like Spycraft 101. Pretend to be drowsy, act confused, make up wild stories, contradict yourself, maybe even fake being psychotic.
Basically, become an unreliable witness deliberately. Turn it back on them.
Yeah. And then you have that amazing story of Cardinal my necessity. Confessed to all sorts of crazy stuff under duress.
But he added those initials, right? CF.
Coactus feci. I was compelled to do this. A tiny, hidden act of defiance. A signal it wasn't real.
Incredible. Okay, let's shift to the Korean War POWs and the Chinese thought reform. That sounds like it went much further than just drugs or simple interrogation.
Oh, much further. It was a systematic attempt to change how prisoners thought, their core beliefs. They were constantly told intellectuals were enemies of the people, forced to write these incredibly detailed autobiographies.
And any tiny mistake was a lie.
Treated as a deliberate lie, yes, to create constant anxiety, undermine their confidence. But the really key thing the Chinese introduced was intense group pressure.
How did that work?
Small cells, daily forced confessions of crimes, then brutal criticism sessions from fellow prisoners.
From their own comrades. Wow.
Exactly. This relentless pressure to conform, to criticize yourself and others honestly. It was incredibly powerful for shaping behavior.
Dimsdale talks about the Ricketts, Allen and Adele, American scholars held in China. They came back and faced suspicion. Allen even sort of confessed his academic work was spying.
Caught in the middle, yeah. Mistrusted by everyone. And this is where Edward Hunter's idea of brainwashing really took hold. He painted this picture of creating a mindless, communist automaton.
A living puppet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His accounts were terrifying. Yeah. Mock executions, starvation, sleep deprivation, forcing them to memorize communist texts, endless group criticism, solitary. He even saw a quasi-religious angle, confession as cleansing, leading to conformity.
Just sounds horrific. And you have to layer onto that the actual conditions in the POW camps during the war, right? The cold, the lack of food, medicine, constant propaganda.
Absolutely. Those conditions made them far more vulnerable. Then you had those infamous confessions from American pilots about biological warfare.
Which the U.S. denied, and the pilots retracted later.
Right. Colonel Walker Mahurin described the intense process that finally broke him, forced him to confess. It really makes you doubt anything said under that kind of pressure.
But then what about the 21 American GIs who refused to come home? That seems to complicate the simple brainwashing idea.
It does. Virginia Paisley did some deep reporting on them, and she found many had, well, issues before they were even captured. Insecurities, lack of direction, feeling like outsiders already. It suggests their decision wasn't just about the Chinese techniques.
So a mix of vulnerability and persuasion?
It looks like a complex interaction. You can't discount the brutal methods the Chinese used. Dr. Mayo documented horrific torture. But individual factors clearly played a role too. It wasn't just about turning everyone into robots.
It's never that simple, is it? Okay, so this fear, this mystery around what happened in Korea, it leads directly to the CIA getting involved, right, MKUltra. The CIA strikes back, as Dimsdale puts it.
Yes, exactly. The agency got really interested in mind control. They poured money into behavioral research projects with code names like Bluebird, Artichoke, and the most famous MKUltra,
Yeah.
spread across universities, research places, often secretly.
And what were they trying to achieve?
Broad goals, really.
Mhm.
Figure out how to extract information reliably, even against someone's will, how to control behavior, and of course, how to defend against the same techniques if used on Americans.
The scale of it is just mind-boggling, and often skirting or crossing ethical lines. Dimsdale mentions Cornell's Institute for Social Ecology as a key funding channel.
And there's an interesting connection. CIA Director Dulce's son was injured in Korea, and he knew neurologist Harold Wolff, who apparently had ties back to Pavlovian research. It feels like all these threads connect.
It seems the Cold War pressure just created this environment where almost anything seemed justifiable in the name of national security.
That's a fair assessment. A sense of urgency, a willingness to explore some very dark avenues.
And one of the darkest and most infamous parts of MKUltra was the work with LSD and other hallucinogens.
Right. It flowed pretty logically from the earlier truth drug research, but they took it much further. Could LSD be used for coercion? Could it be weaponized?
So they ran studies.
Tons of classified studies trying to figure out dosage, how to give it to someone secretly. Could it induce psychosis? Could it incapacitate soldiers? Henry Beecher at Harvard even looked at it as a potential military weapon.
But Dimsdale says a lot of the science was shaky.
Very shaky. Untrained people observing, not enough long-term data, not enough medical backup. It was incredibly irresponsible by today's standards, frankly.
And sometimes they struggled to even find researchers or got taken advantage of.
Yeah, there were challenges. Dimsdale mentions Richard Wendt and his failed truth drug mix. And then there's the absolutely horrifying LSD experiment on Tusco the elephant, documented by Jolly West.
Ugh, that story. Just awful. Shows a complete lack of ethical boundaries.
Truly. And their goals for human testing were just as disturbing. Immobilization, interrogation, making people defect, discrediting foreign leaders. And let's be clear, volunteering was often not part of the equation. People were dosed without consent, sometimes with lethal results.
A really dark chapter.
Driven by fear, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fear of the perceived enemy.
Okay, another area they explored was sensory deprivation. Hebb's work up at McGill University.
Yeah, Hebb found that cutting people off from all sensory input had really weird effects. Hallucinations, but also, crucially, people became much more suggestible.
They did studies.
Students in deprivation tanks listening to tapes about ghosts and psychic stuff. Some actually started believing it, trying telepathy.
Wow.
And Larry Hinkle, who dealt with POWs, thought this was the perfect interrogation setup. You make someone malleable, desperate to talk, but without any obvious signs of force.
Did Hebb work directly for the CIA?
The exact extent is debated, but it's known he did classified military research connected to brainwashing. And the Soviets were doing their own thing with drug-induced sleep therapy, also linked back to Pavlov's ideas about resting the brain.
Seems everyone was trying to crack the code of the mind. Which brings us to Ewan Cameron in Montreal. Allen Memorial Institute, psychic driving, de-patterning, funded by MKUltra. This sounds particularly grim.
Cameron's work was extreme.
Yeah.
Incredibly damaging. He used prolonged drug comas, massive doses of electroshock therapy, playing looped tape messages for hours, days, trying to wipe the slate clean, essentially, and rebuild the personality.
Wiping the slate clean.
De-patterning, he called it. He was also famously anti-religion, clashed publicly with the church over his humanist views.
And the results for his patients.
Devastating. Long-lasting psychological harm. It led to major lawsuits, big settlements from both the U.S. and Canadian governments years later. His work is now seen as negligent, unethical, abhorrent, really.
He became this real-life bogeyman figure, didn't he?
He did. A symbol of scientific ambition gone horribly wrong, completely untethered from ethics.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Dimsdale also looks at Stockholm Syndrome, the classic case, the Stockholm bank robbery, hostages bonding with robbers, fearing the police.
Right. It's that counterintuitive psychological response to being trapped, under threat.
Yeah.
We even saw elements of it in the Moscow theater siege in 2002. Chechen terrorists, brutal conditions, yet some hostages expressed sympathy afterwards.
It's hard to understand from the outside, and survivors often face stigma, right? Like they chose to side with their captors.
Exactly, which is so unfair. Elizabeth Smart spoke really powerfully about it. It's about survival, and nobody else has the right to judge those survival mechanisms. It's often unconscious.
Which leads us straight into the Patricia Hearst case. That seems like a collision of Stockholm Syndrome and maybe more direct indoctrination.
It's incredibly complex. You have this wealthy heiress kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA, and then seemingly she transforms. That bank robbery footage, her holding a gun, it's shocking.
Hard to square with just being a victim.
Right. And like the Stockholm hostages, reports said she started fearing the police more than the SLA. Then there was the manipulation, including sexual abuse, by SLA member Willie Wolf.
So was it coercion? Was it conversion?
Her fiancé at the time, Stephen Weed, talked to Regis Debray, who felt it was more like a religious conversion under pressure than purely political. Weed himself called it something in between joining and being forced in accommodation to survive.
And the trial must have been a nightmare trying to argue brainwashing.
Huge legal hurdles. For bank robbery, the duress defense usually needs an immediate threat, right there and then. Not weeks of captivity. There was tons of psychiatric testimony on both sides.
Did they try to get experts?
Oh, yeah. They considered William Sargent, the British psychiatrist who was mentioned earlier. But they worried his strong public views might not play well with an American jury.
What was his take?
He thought she was brainwashed. He used this vivid, if grim, analogy. The exhausted rabbit running straight into the stoat's mouth. Pure survival instinct overriding reason.
Wow. And the defense used that quote, right? About resistance fading, reality blurring, will breaking.
Yes. And the kicker is, that quote was originally from Cardinal Mindszenty's Forced Confession, drawing a direct line from political coercion to Hearst's situation.
That's powerful. And then Jonestown happened not long after, right? That must have really cemented the idea of brainwashing in the public mind.
Absolutely. People like John Wayne were explicitly connecting Jonestown to what they thought happened to hers. It became part of the cultural conversation.
Which brings us, almost full circle, back to your neighbors, Heaven's Gate.
Yeah. Finding out these quiet people running their web business were part of that group, the mass suicide. It was just profoundly shocking. They seemed so normal, outwardly, but they had these incredibly intense beliefs about leaving Earth on a spaceship.
It forces that question again, how? How do people get to that point? Castration, suicide.
How does that become a rational choice?
Yeah.
And Dimsdale contrasts them with Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Jones started with, social justice ideals, anti-racism.
But it twists.
Badly. Became manipulative, paranoid. The communal living idea soured. Jones feared government plots, warned about mind control, ironically, while using his own forms of control.
Like those abusive confession sessions, the learning crew punishments, drugging people.
All of that. Plus the total isolation in Jonestown, no outside contact, passports taken, armed guards, those terrifying mock suicide drills, absolute control.
Until Congressman Leo Ryan showed up.
Right. Initial visit seemed okay. Then people secretly asked to leave. Jones freaked out. Ryan was attacked, then murdered at the airstrip along with others, leading to the final horrific command.
Just unimaginable. And Heaven's Gate, with Marshall Applewhite Dew and Bonnie Nettles Ty, their belief system was different, right? UFOs?
UFOs, yes. Belief in a next level beyond human existence. To get there, you had to shed all earthly ties, family, possessions, even your physical body eventually, and wait for the spaceship, which they thought was trailing the Hale-Bopp comet.
And those final videos, Dimsdale quotes them, they sound almost happy, designed.
Eerily calm, some of them. Talking about being weary of the world, their bodies just being containers, looking forward to the next level. That comment from Trocity about feeling relief after castration, it's chilling. It shows how completely invested they were.
So, were they delusional? How do you even define that when a whole group believes something?
That's the tricky part. Psychiatry is cautious about labeling shared religious or cultural beliefs as delusions. The line is often about how fixed the belief is, whether the person can consider any contradictory evidence.
And Dimsdale's conclusion.
He leans away from a simple delusional disorder label, suggests it's more like group contagion of beliefs or conversion, heavily influenced by their extreme isolation and shared worldview. The group dynamic was incredibly powerful.
It really highlights the power of isolation and shared reality, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Cut off from conflicting information, reinforcing each other's beliefs, can lead people down some very strange paths.
Okay, so finally, Dimsdale looks to the future. Neuroscience, social media. Where does brainwashing go next?
Well, he notes something Pavlov observed ages ago, and even Shakespeare before him: disrupting sleep weakens resistance. Even just chronic, partial sleep loss messes with our thinking, makes us more malleable.
Which is relevant to modern life for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Then he speculates. Could future techniques involve things like deep brain stimulation, using electrical or magnetic pulses to directly tweak beliefs or behaviors, maybe targeting pleasure or pain centers?
That sounds terrifyingly invasive, like installing
The
beliefs.
potential is there, theoretically.
Yeah.
The addictive nature of pleasure stimulation, for instance. And then, of course, there's social media.
Ah, the modern elephant in the room.
Right. Dimsdale connects the dots. Historical brainwashing often involved limiting outside information, covert manipulation. Sound familiar? Social media can do that on a massive scale, spreading disinformation, fake news, fueling
But
extremism.
it creates echo chambers.
Exactly. And it amplifies conformity pressure. Think of those classic Ash experiments on group influence
Uh-huh.
and Milgram on obedience. Social media can turbocharge those effects. There's that quote Dimsdale uses from Singer and Lalick about cults.
Which one?
If you say it in front of others, you'll do it. Once you do it, you'll think it. Once you think it, you'll believe that you thought of it yourself.
Oof. That's chillingly accurate for online dynamics sometimes.
And the targeting. Social media messaging is like hyper-personalized advertising, drawing on everything we know about persuasion. Think Vance Packard's Hidden Persuaders, but with algorithms.
And we see the real-world consequences, right? Pizzagate.
A perfect tragic example. A completely baseless conspiracy theory spread online leads to real violence. And disturbingly large numbers of people actually believed it. It shows how potent this online manipulation can be.
So, wrapping this up, we've covered a lot of ground. Early interrogation, religious conversions, Cold War paranoia, M-Cultura, cults, Stockholm Syndrome, all the way to today's digital world.
It's quite a journey through the darker side of influence. And what strikes me reading Dimsdale is how relevant it all still feels. The term brainwashing might sound kind of pulpy, but the underlying issues,
Susceptibility to disinformation, cult dynamics, hostage situations, false confessions.
they haven't gone away. They've just evolved, maybe, found new mediums.
Yeah, I started out thinking of my neighbors, this bizarre, isolated incident, but the book shows it's part of this much longer, ongoing story.
It really is.
Yeah.
Which leaves us with a pretty stark thought, doesn't it? With neuroscience advancing and social media becoming ever more pervasive.
Right.
What does the future of coercive persuasion look like? What does it mean for our autonomy, for society?
It really makes you think. How are subtle influences working on us all the time, online and offline, and how vital is critical thinking just to navigate the world today? Definitely something for our listeners to chew on.